Welcome. I'm Richard Shyness. I'm the Dean of the Dietrich College of Humanities and Social Sciences. Great pleasure to have Lane Bess here today to speak to us as part of the Dietrich College Entrepreneurship Speaker Series that we instituted just at the beginning of this year. Lane is the second speaker in the series, and when I got to visit him out in Silicon Valley a year ago, part of that visit inspired us to actually build and fund this speakership series. So it's a great pleasure to have him here. So I'm just going to tell you a few things about Lane, but I think he's going to mostly speak for himself. We're starting a bit early so we can get to Q&A, so there might be people coming in. Don't worry about that. So Lane, as it turns out, is an alumnus of Carnegie Mellon. He graduated in 1983, just before I showed up. He was a major in managerial economics. Right? He then got his MBA at Dayton University, and then he has proceeded to get involved in lots of very exciting, very interesting companies, three of which became hugely successful: Palo Alto Networks, Zscaler, and Trend Micro Internet Security. All companies ended up having a global footprint and doing really interesting work, in many cases cloud-based things or security, which I'll tell you about today. But I wanted to just say a word about Lane and his similarity in a certain respect to our first speaker, Javier Soltero, both of whom found discipline a little bit late. Certainly well after entering Carnegie Mellon. So I hope it's okay to tell this story. But Lane was here, and in his case, he was dating a woman who told him to shape up and get to work, or he would be single in a hurry. Being a man of sound mind and impeccable judgment, Lane weighed his options and decided an investment in his academic future was also an investment in his love life. Clearly a win-win if there ever was one. Buckled down, and the rest is history, an incredibly successful one. So it's a great pleasure to have Lane here to share his experiences. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Well, let me switch this one on too. I don't know if I'll need this because I tend to have a pretty good voice. Everybody can hear me? All right, we'll just go with that. Well, first of all, thank you, Dean Shine. Thank you, Rebecca. It was actually through some outreach that she found this guy who disappeared off campus for about 25 years. I think I came back for a spring carnival somewhere in between there.
Campus has changed a little bit.
Yeah, I just missed spring carnival. I would have liked to have been there to see what kind of times they're putting in these days. But so thank you again for having me back. And I feel honored to be able to speak to you all students. Just to prove to you, I actually dug this out. This is my, how many are you first-year students? Okay, anybody upperclassmen getting ready to graduate and find their way? Okay. Yeah, this is my first semester transcript. 2.5. That made me distinctly available for academic probation. But in there's a little bit of a lesson. I think there's a few lessons, and that is the grades you get are not necessarily the measure of who you are. Grades as a whole, and what you learn here is only part of what you could potentially become, and a lot of other things. I didn't end up marrying that woman. She did turn me around. I think she's a graphic designer in Cleveland now. But let me just start off. I'm going to try to make this real-life story as well as some real meat and potatoes. And what I share with you today will be, I think, available on video. And the presentation slides are slides, hopefully basic enough that you're going to be able to look at and use them as a reference, because I tell you, after 32 years of going through big companies and then doing startups, if you were ever to boil it down to a small deck, I think we got it here. So hopefully in some ways this will be a quick reference that you could bounce up, or at some point you're going to say, well, I remember I heard that once in this lecture at Carnegie Mellon University. Let me just ask a question first, because the topic for today, which...
So I advanced the slide by mistake.
Oh, that's okay. That's all right. We'll advance to that. The topic for today is, building great companies and tapping into your entrepreneurial spirit. So I guess the first question I'll ask is, does anybody in this room think that they want to start their own company someday? And the others, I assume you'll figure that out along the way. Frankly, my goal was to get my GPA back up, graduate, get a job with a big company so that I had a secure job and career path, and then ultimately see where that led me. I thought I was going to be CEO of that company someday. Oddly enough, that company came back to me to ask me to interview for the CEO position years after I'd left it. But the reality is, at some point along the way, I realized that what I wanted to do was be involved in starting a company. And so one of the points I make here is you don't have to decide that coming out of university. Although at the same time, there are many of you here who are going to be compelled to want to do that, and you should be comfortable following that. And how well you succeed can vary depending on what you're doing, how passionate you are, and how you go about doing it. And so hopefully today I can give you some tidbits, some help along the way. After working for 32 years, I got the opportunity to retire at a relatively young age. And now what I do is spend most of my time investing in startups and in young people like yourself. On a weekly basis, I'll be in Silicon Valley meeting with 2 to 5 entrepreneurs or people who have worked with me in other companies who are going out. And I have this little kitty of money because of my success that we call Best Ventures. So that's an email address, a real email address, that if at some point you get it in your mind, you want to follow up on this or ask a question, or if you have a great idea, you can reach out to me there. So moving forward, there are 5 areas I wanted to cover today, and they're listed here. And it's hard to boil down a career's worth of advice to would-be business people or entrepreneurs, professionals. But the first is in a question of are you an entrepreneur, a founder, or a CEO? Right? And it's know who you are. The other one is really, if you're going to start a company or if you've got a great idea, you've got to have a real good vision, and define that company real well. And we'll talk about that as well. And then there's the execution. Actually, a good chunk of the time we'll spend here will be, some of the keys to successful execution. That's what I call the real easy cheat sheet slides that I'll put up here. And then there's the notion of raising capital. If you happen to be independently wealthy or your parents are willing to bet on you in a big way, that's a great thing. But most people that go out and start a company are going to have to raise capital, and there's a lot of things that, in a lot of ways you can do that, and a lot of things you might consider. And then we'll talk a little bit about culture, and I finish with that because the companies I've been involved with have varied greatly in terms of their success and their path and pace to success as a result of culture. And that might sound like a soft thing, but it's a real thing. So let's start off on that first point that I raise here. There we go. An entrepreneur, CEO, know who you are. And I might look at some notes here because there's so much I want to say that I could talk for probably far past the hour. But I want to kind of keep it boiled down. And it's really interesting as I've worked, hand in hand as a founder and with founders of companies. Some people know that they want to be a founder, but they don't want to be a CEO. And they're two different things. Founder can be somebody who has a big idea and is somebody who can motivate people to follow that idea. On the other side, a CEO is somebody who's going to have to deal with the operational day-to-day that's going to make that company a success. And at some level, you can't have one without the other. Some people want to be both. Probably the most successful company I did was Palo Alto Networks. It's probably it might be the fastest growing technology company in the last decade. The founder of that company with me was a gentleman by the name of Nir Zuk. He had a passion for essentially putting the hurt on the company he worked for the first 15 years of his career. He got frustrated and he says, I can do this better than that company does it, but I can't do it inside that company. So, got together and he says, I don't want to be CEO. I just want to make great product. So he knew what he wanted to do, and he knew what his limitations were and what he didn't want to do. He didn't want to manage the day-to-day. We got together and did that company, and that company, I remember we sat around and we thought, oh, wow, we can make this a public company, and maybe it'll be worth $1 billion someday. Now, 5 years or 4 years past the IPO, it's worth about $12.5 billion. And so, that was a combination, and I'm happy to be the third largest shareholder of that company too. But that was a situation where a founder understood what his skills were, and he coupled with a CEO. And similar types of things you see, if you take a look, good examples, we all know Mark Zuckerberg, right? There was a guy who was passionate at your age about something, so passionate that there was nothing else that was important to him. He decided he wanted to be the CEO of that company. In fact, he did a brilliant job of securing his position as CEO when outside money came in. But what he did was he surrounded himself with a lot of good people who could help him be a CEO. So again, different paths in terms of understanding what your leadership skills are. I could go on in terms of opportunities. I always prefer to be CEO in the companies I got involved with because I'm an operational guy. I like the nuts and bolts of what makes things happen. We'll talk more about that in a little bit forward here. But I most recently did a company which will probably go public next year. It's called Zscaler. And with that, I teamed up with a founder who had done 3 previous companies. And all 3 of those companies he sold, and he sold them for a total of about combined $500 million. So this guy really doesn't have to work. He's a self-made guy. But he had to take a company public. It just, he could not sleep, he could not stop until he saw one all the way past the finish line. We teamed up about 5 years ago to do just that with that company. I've moved on to do my individual investing now, but he's now gotten to the point where he will take that company. He's got all the skills, and after 3, I won't call them false starts, and most people would be happy to have the kind of outcomes he did, but after 3 attempts at being a CEO and really trying to aspire to be a public company CEO, he's going to have his day in the sun next year. So know your skills. Don't be afraid to say, I need to partner with people to get this company to where it needs to be. So I'll move on to the next one, which is the next point on the slide, which is on the deck, which is called creating a vision and defining your company. And I'll say a few things about this, but one thing I will say, and I'll go to perhaps a person that many people know and say and idolize as being one of the most successful people in terms of taking a product vision or a strategy forward. The point here is that you can focus, and this word focus is a dangerous one. You can focus on a lot of things, My wife tells me I focus on a lot of things, and she calls me ADD. But it's really being able to focus on the one thing. If you take a look at what's been successful in many really over-the-top companies, it's been that the founders or the founding team have had a very, very deep focus on what they're going to do and what they're going to create, whether it be a product, a solution, or a service of some sort. But the other point that I think is equally important along these lines is, product without a strategy, doesn't really make a company. And, a few examples I use here are, and I'll take some ones that are recently in the news because they're painful examples of how great ideas and great company opportunities can kind of go astray. And Theranos is a good one. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Theranos. Blood testing, a very highly touted company, the CEO, Elizabeth Holmes. They introduced this technology into an industry which is very complex, the healthcare industry. and without understanding all the complexities of getting the proper approvals, verification of testing, the company, which was touted as being one of these multi-billion-dollar early-stage companies, is practically falling apart. So there's a good example of, there was a great product, but the strategy might have been also good, but the execution had some flaws. You can look at other things, and we've seen a few rounds of this. Back in the dot-com era, anybody know the dot-com era? I pretty much lost everything in the dot-com era. Seriously, I moved out to California. This is my first time I got to Silicon Valley in 2000. And there was this hot startup I just had to be a part of. They brought me in to be a co-founder, picked up my family, and then very abruptly the market went south. And I always called myself the most capable guy that showed up in Silicon Valley at the wrong time, or too late. Back then there were a lot of companies popping up which were big on home delivery of goods, home delivery of groceries. In fact, we see a lot of them now, Peapod and things like that. But this is probably the second or third iteration of these companies, right? The infrastructure wasn't there, the systems to interconnect and make sure that things were done right. And so there's an issue where, again, a great concept, but a really poor execution plan. And in the end of the day, if you don't have an execution plan, it isn't sustainable. But you take a look at some of the best long-standing companies, and I'll pick two that you're very familiar with as well, just for the sake of example. Amazon. Now, here's the irony. In 1992, I think I was like 30-something, I was the product manager at AT&T launching their internet business. So I kind of launched unlimited internet for $19.95 back in 1996. So some of you can thank me for all you can eat. You can't, I have nothing to do with the throttling on, or anything like that. But at the time, we presented to the executive committee at AT&T, and we wanted to expand AT&T from being just a network company to also deliver content and value. So I made a recommendation as a brash young guy to buy Amazon.com for $40 million. And I was promptly shot down as saying, we're not a content company, we're a network company. Now, truthfully, I think AT&T would have probably screwed it up along the way somewhere. But you go back there, and I remember at that time, Amazon was just delivering hardcover books, not even digital books, right? But if you understood his strategy, it was vast. In fact, almost unbelievable at the time, right? That they were going to be able to stream stuff down and deliver this and expand to deliver all kinds of products that were being bought at Walmart at the time that nobody would ever believe people would buy online. But he had a strategy. And that strategy even was able to expand into AWS, their hosting platform, which is almost the gold standard. Arguably, they do have some outages, but it's the gold standard. There's a strategy well executed. Even Netflix, right? Interesting enough, those two are competing, and they're going to compete big time with Amazon Prime. So it'll be interesting to see how those strategies evolve. But I remember an old gentleman who lived on the street with me walking down to the mailbox, getting his Netflix disc, sending one back and getting a new one sent to him. And that was the early stage of a strategy which led to streaming of those movies and ultimately content creation. So great strategies that really led to companies of significant size. So as a founder or as an entrepreneur, as somebody that wants to create a company, be careful of a few things. Number one, that you think the thing you create, this great shiny object, is a company. It may be an idea. It takes a lot more to make it a company. It takes a strategy and an execution plan. Also, there's a thing which you learn as you get further on in your business studies, a thing called TAM, Total Addressable Market. At the end of the day, whatever you're making or developing as a company, you want to believe that the market you're going after is large enough that both the revenue you can create and the value of the company can be substantial. So that's an important part. And then there's the question of, are you innovating on an existing product or category, or are you creating a new category? One can be harder than the other, and the other can be harder than the others. For example, Palo Alto Networks. We knew that everybody in the world knew what a firewall was, and that's what it was, in your network, a firewall. And we also knew that there were incumbents that were tremendously strong and embedded in all of the companies that operate worldwide. So there was a product innovation attempt. And the product innovation attempt can have its challenges because you have to prove to the market that you've got a true innovation and that you're in fact, capable of doing it better than the incumbents, right? So that's a task to take on, and sometimes when I look in the rearview mirror, I'm actually surprised at how well we did, because that's a hard one to take. Uber's another example, right? We could talk a lot of things about Uber, and I use that because I think it's something that you all have probably used or are aware of. Again, I'm actually a small investor in Uber. It's nice to know they're worth a lot, so small it can be worth something. But Uber, again, that was an industry that, for the most part, nobody thought you could ever innovate, right? And take an industry of cab drivers and get people to use their own cars and actually do this work, deliver people to where they want to be. So that's a good example of an innovation on an existing product or service or industry, right? The other, which is again challenging in itself, is creating a new category, right? Because you have to ask yourself, well, if there was a category to create, why didn't somebody else do it? Or, did somebody fail in the effort to do it? That was the most recent company who did, Zscaler, where after 10, 15 years in the security space doing startups, we were going to now take that and put that in the cloud. When in fact, and in some cases, cloud security was a new category because most of the people who were getting their security were always used to putting it on a hardware box or software on their computer or in their network, not essentially letting some cloud service deliver that. So they all have their own challenges, but knowing what they are and again, having a strategy and an execution plan is critically important. First mover, probably things you'll learn about in the next few years. If you can be first mover, be first mover. Everybody knows that there's a comparable service to Uber called Lyft. It's a hard thing for a follower to really be the dominant brand. I think that's something to also be conscious of as you start a company. So now I'd like to get into the execution piece, and this is where I kind of say, in fact, this is possibly the first conversation I have with every company that comes to me and says, I heard that you can help me. And I'm like, okay. and I get people coming from the data space, business intelligence space, security space, consumer space. And I say, well, okay, what can we talk about? And it really starts with this discussion, and I want to do this. I want to be careful here. I got this thing in Thailand. I think it might burn a hole in this. Really, I took this out, and it literally can put a dot on a building 5 miles away. So we'll just, but I just want to point to this here. I'll pay for the damage. But consider A, green, go, an A, F, red. From a color code standpoint, and these are what I call 5 dimensions, and then the culture piece, which I think are kind of the key components that you want to score well in. And when you can, assuming you now know you want to be a CEO or a founder, you've got the right people around you to do that company, you've got the idea, and you've assessed whether there's a market big enough for it, and in fact whether you're innovating, disrupting, or you've got something meaningful that customers are going to want, then you focus on this here. And I'll just go to the next slide here, which starts to paint the picture for you. We've talked about the product. This is fundamental. If you don't have a great product and you execute in every other way, marketing, distribution, sales, you don't have a real sustainable company. So you want to make sure that your product, your service, your strategy, your differentiation or fit within an existing market or is truly something that is sustainable, can be differentiated. I've seen and I've worked with so many people that have come out of companies like Oracle, VMware, Cisco, I'm mentioning a lot of companies, and even Yahoo, Facebook, that have come out of those companies and seen a missing piece, a deficiency, an opportunity, and they've created and started a company because they had that insight. In fact, some of the best startups that I've been involved with come from people who have spent 5 to maybe 10 years in a company and used the knowledge and learning they got in that company to see a spot, to see a white space and start a company after leaving that. So this is fundamental. And so you want to score an A on this. Now, if you score a B or a C, and going back to that rating scale on the product, you're, I believe, at a bit of a disadvantage out of the gate. But it doesn't mean that you can't have a successful company. It just means you're going to have to operate and excel on some of the other go-to-market components. I hope am I going over everybody's head? I mean, because I could get real deep in this, but I'm going to try to keep it at a level that we can there. So these are the next 4 dimensions, which are fundamental. So again, take everything else I've discussed and shared with you to this point. You got the right product. People are going to love this. It's going to, we're going to make millions. The next pieces you want to focus on, are here. So the sales team, again, if you're selling to businesses, right? When we sell internet security, we have to call on JP Morgan, we have to call on Hertz Rental Car, we have got to call on United Airline, and you got to have a guy or a gal who's going to go knock on the door and essentially say, look at what we got, right? Or it might be a different go-to-market. The web has provided tremendous ability for companies to sell their products. Product which we made back in the day when I was the president of Trend Micro, that was a software product that sat on your computer. Well, the ability to sell that product, we used to sell it, in fact, it still sells in Best Buy through Geek Squad. It's a product called Titanium. But that product can easily be downloaded. You can offer free. So there's a lot of things that you can do. So that second dimension is how you're going to reach the market, how you're going to get your customers. And again, I could probably do a whole session or weeks or a whole course maybe on each one of these boxes. But for today, just think of that. How are you going to reach that customer? What's the most efficient, cost-effective way to do it? I've seen startups where they said, we got it, we're ready to go to market. They raise venture money and they hire 100 salespeople. In Europe, in Asia, in the US, and these salespeople, are having trouble selling. And in the meantime, they're burning through their cash, and their board of directors is saying, well, how are you going to make the company a success? You're burning through your cash. Because they haven't thought through that, how to sell, how to go to market. Which brings to the next dimension number 3 in the red, which is the sales enablement or the execution plan. Having your go-to-market strategy is one thing, but how you're actually going to enable that. So I remember at Palo Alto Networks, we hired our first 5 salespeople. They now have about 780, right? But they were those, and I remember them by name, and I remember fighting in the trenches with them. And they went out to a customer, nothing happened. And so I got on the plane with Nir Zook, the co-founder, and we went out and went on some sales calls. Best way, with your own eyes. We went on some sales calls with the sales guy, and we listened to him sell the product, and we're like, is that our company? I don't know. That doesn't sound like anything that we were. And so we realized that we've got to train them. Sales playbooks, videos, tutorials, make it so that, you know, your sales, your team, you know, is going to be able to take that product and move it to market. So there's a whole set of things to enable, and it's the same in anything. You know, again, pulling a book from Uber. You know, Uber, if you've read anything about it, again, I know the founder, and you know, they have a tremendous process for going into a country, setting up shop, recruiting people, training them, certifying them, you know, supposedly checking their records. In fact, recently they got into trouble in San Francisco because they made a claim that they had the best process for verifying, you know, the credibility of their drivers, and they were sued for $25 million by the city of San Francisco and lost that. But being able to onboard your team and get them capable of selling and or getting your product to market. The next one is probably equally important, is getting your own go-to-market strategy. It's, you know, what is your leverage? And leverage is a very important word, because guess what? In an early stage, if you're starting your own company, you can't afford to hire enough salespeople, you know, particularly in the early stages, to, you know, be able to get momentum in the market. So what you need to do is have partners. In technology, they call them resellers, or value-added resellers, or distributors. But they can also be alliance partners, people who distribute your product and carry your name and your logo or your brand. You know, distribution leverage is a fantastic thing. My next door neighbor is a gentleman who started a company called CrossFit. I don't know if any of you do CrossFit, but you know, Greg Glassman is his name, and you know, Greg had a simple model: build a basic program and get people to carry the word and distribute that brand worldwide. So your distribution and your leverage for growing the company is something you want to think about. And again, technology these days offers a tremendous, you know, platform for doing that. And the final dimension I'll talk to, I'm going to just check on time here, we're looking good. The final one I'll talk to you about briefly is you know, demand generation, and how you actually, what's your brand strategy, how you make yourself the default or de facto for that service, that product that you've created. And again, we can think of a lot of companies that have done that very, very successfully. We had, and again, I'll go back to Palo Alto Networks, because again, it was one of those probably improbable things. We coined a term, next generation firewall. And nobody knew what a next generation firewall was. We had to basically define that in the market's eyes. And our strategy for there was to go to all of the technology analysts and basically get them to understand that the old technology didn't do this. And we had a very important catalyst that helped us, and this was part of our strategy: social media. So it turns out that most firewalls, if you were doing social media and your employees inside the company, they could be spending their whole day, you know, on Facebook or on YouTube and doing whatever they wanted. And the existing technology was not capable of addressing the new shift in the market, these new advents of social media. So we used that as a catalyst to say, well, the next generation firewall is going to be able to allow you to control your network and the use of the internet by your employees in a way that the old technology can't. And so we picked up on that, and we were able to then position the company as essentially the next generation firewall. So then you go to customers and say, well, why would you want your old firewall? Don't you want the next generation firewall? And once you create that brand momentum and that understanding of any product in any category, you know, it's very powerful. And again, we can think of so many companies that have done that, and they've been able to. You know, you look at companies like, I know the CEO of Under Armour. You know, how do you get into a market that's dominated by Nike, Adidas, in some of the overseas markets? You know, and you know, their strategy was to, you know, was originally through the material they used and how well that absorbed and dried and you know, I don't think anybody ever thought about that. You know, he just bought a Nike shirt and he just ran and you sweat. But they were able to really position the brand as something that brought an innovation to an existing thing. And I think right now, you know, they're growing significantly relative to their competition. So I'll move on from this, but again, as you get this deck and can look back at this, you got an idea, think about these things. And if you really do think about these things, you'll be in good shape. The last one we'll talk about is people and culture. I'll come to that in just a few moments because I do want to talk first about, you know, how to get the money to start your company. I just want to give you one last point on the different outcomes based on execution. So whenever I look at a startup or a company and its potential, its strategy, its executive team, you know, the vision, the impact, the total addressable market, I'll grade on each of these 5 dimensions. And I'll typically formulate a thought as to whether the company is going to be an M&A, that's a merger and acquisition. That's like you start your company and somebody comes and says, I want to buy your company. Or on the far side here is you get a company that's potentially highly valuable and you can go into the public markets. As an entrepreneur, if you can get there, there's no better outcome than that. You know, that's the big win. Of course, many people have been very successful. I spent some time with an entrepreneur he's living in Santa Monica, California. He's had 3 companies. He sold them. It's probably netted about $30 million. For most people, that's cool. You know, call it a day. But he keeps doing it. And he says, it's okay. I don't need to build a public company. I'm happy building meaningful companies that eventually be acquired or become part of some other company's technology. And that's fine too, right? So moving on here, I'm going to move quickly through this. Again, for reference, I'll give you these slides. When you talk about sales productivity, you're talking about how to make that sales team productive. And that word productivity is very important. It gets to that point I raised earlier. If you hire 100 salespeople and they're not productive, then you're burning the cash. You're paying them salary. They're spending time on airplanes and taking people to business lunches, and it's not producing meaningful revenue for the company. So sales productivity is what you want to focus on and what it takes to make each salesperson productive. And salespeople like to be productive. In Palo Alto Networks, the first 80 salespeople in the company, because they got stock in the company, are all multimillionaires. The first 80 salespeople. They not only made their sales salaries and their commissions, but they got stock that was worth a lot of money. So sales productivity is an important thing. And you know, equally in terms of the customer acquisition, you want to understand the focus, if it's an enterprise or a consumer market. Are you global? You know, a lot of people say just focus on domestic US. If you can make a successful company in the US, then you can expand globally. Some people try to take on the world out of the gate. Are you industry focused, right? You can make a product which works for any, you know, industry. There are companies that have made success just in serving the federal government because the federal government spends a lot of money, right? So something else to think about. And then ultimately, there's the question of, you know, what's the size, you know, of the customers that you're going after. There are companies that have gone after small businesses. Then there's companies that have gone after Fortune 5,000. And on the demand generation, again, I don't want to go into the detail of this. Again, a reference that I'll give you. There's a lot of dimensions to doing that. In terms of getting your brand, your positioning, you really want to think about all of these components. So for your reference, beyond today, I'll leave you with that. I want to get to this next point in terms of raising capital. If most of you are like me, your parents aren't wealthy enough to write you a check and start a company, which is okay, because there are other ways. You know, there are other ways to raise the money. But number one thing I'll say, and people always say, if you can, use other people's money. If If you use other people's money, you give up something. You give up control. And as has happened to many entrepreneurs who I know, they actually can find themselves kicked out of their own company. It happens. And believe me, venture investors will have no hesitation if they think their investment is going to go the wrong way to do that. So you need to protect yourself. Well, first of all, if you can fund it yourself, do it, right? That's what I did in the later years, and that's what many people would prefer to do. If you have to raise some outside capital, just know that you'll lose some level of control. As I said, and that's a new entrepreneur will go in and they'll be so happy that an investor will like their idea and is willing to write a check for $20 million for 35% of the company, and they'll raise that money, and then before you know it, they'll find that they now only own about 5 or 10% of the company. You know, the guy who, the founder of Box, familiar with Box stores? Yeah. Yeah, okay. Founder of Box, great idea. Went through all the battles of getting that company to the point of an IPO about a little over a year ago. Yeah, a little over a year ago. And for all that hard work, for all his great ideas, in some sense, some will say that helped redefine storage in a cloud. The guy didn't net a heck of a lot when it all got watered down and all the investors came in. So that is probably the biggest learning that a first-time entrepreneur doing a startup will have. They will be so thrilled that somebody likes their idea, that they can raise the money and start a company and get it going, that they will at some point realize that they've sold themselves, sometimes to the devil. I have some really great venture relationships and friendships, so I don't really mean to speak poorly on the venture community, because it is an important means of capital to an end. But at the same time, though, my advice to an entrepreneur and an inventor is to really go in with eyes wide open. At the end of the day, you want to have a board of investors that are helpful, collaborative, not overreaching, and quite frankly, that you actually enjoy sitting down and going to lunch or having a beer with, right? So, and there are other sources of capital. There are guys like me that, quite frankly, just want to be involved in some really exciting things and help entrepreneurs have a great degree of success. I've actually found that in the last 3 to 5 years, that's actually become as fulfilling as anything I've ever done in my career. So, again, you need to raise capital. Do it yourself if you can. If you can't, seek advice, be smart about it. I think we've got other people in the room here who also have some wisdom and knowledge on campus in that one. I want to be conscious of time. How we looking here? Okay, good. So I think that's going to take me to the last topic, and that is on culture. I'm going to start by talking about my most recent company, and the founder was a gentleman who was a self-made success. I think he came from the Dust Bowls of India, and he was so exacting in so many things he did that when he asked me to join him to help in this most recent company, Zscaler, he said, "What do you think went wrong, or why couldn't I get the other companies to scale?" And I said, "Okay, well, tell you what. Let me take some time to answer that question for you." And as I talked to the first 25 employees that we had, they complained that the health care was bad. They complained that whenever they had to fly to a meeting in another city, they had to take 3 connections. And they had to stay at Motel 6s. And I said, this might be something about it. I said, if you create a culture in your company that everybody's going to feel like every day they go into work, they're putting on their metal armor jacket and they're going to go to the grind, that's going to create a fatigue. And I just never did that in any of my companies. I said, quite frankly, that might be the single biggest difference between the companies you've done and the outcome we had at Palo Alto or at Trend Micro. And so, we had a culture at Palo Alto where it was, make fun of yourselves. We believed in a mission. We actually believed it was our destiny to beat the big guys, to beat the bigger companies. And we had to take no prisoners. We hired a sales force. I tapped into every killer salesperson, men and women, that I'd probably known for the last decade, and gave them a lot of stock. And they were rewarded for it. But the point is, there was a wonderful culture. And I would contend that even if you have a great product, even if you have a great execution plan, if you don't address the culture and make the company a place where people want to be and want to work crazy hours, because that's what happens in the early phase, you won't get there. So you attend to that, and I think it's in some sense, execution is critical. But culture is that real special sauce, and I'll use that term, the special sauce, on that. Which kind of leads me to kind of a couple closing comments, and then a couple things that I'll leave with you, and then we'll go to questions. So, kind of recapping some of the points we made. As a founder, really understand the market you're going into. There are maybe there are some accidents, but they're few and far between. But there aren't really any accidents in terms of building a wonderful company. It really usually is backed by great product or service strategy, something that customers really need and want. I mean, people wanted to get a taxi faster, so bingo. Why did that did? It seems like such a brilliantly obvious thing, right? And really, you've got to be able to have a strategy along with that. Otherwise, you're kind of winging it. And you can do well winging it. I mean, I've seen people wing it, and they've sold their company for $10, $15 million. And that's actually not bad either, right? But if you want something really special, something long-standing, you're gonna have a good strategy behind it. Let's see, next one here. There you go. Engineer the go-to-market strategy. Pay attention to that one slide with all the boxes on it, and grade yourself. And it might be that you don't know how to grade yourself at first. We'll get people who can help you, come up with that grade. Surround yourself with the best teams, and that really is executives. It could be your best buddies, people who are as passionate as you are about what you're doing. Investors, the right investors. If you can do it yourself, that's fine. But if you can't, there are people who, are going to be looking out for you, who are going to take the same passion and pride in what you do, and then execute on that for success. And then again, I end on that point. Culture of the company is critical, and it really is. I added this last slide, which I'm going to put up here in a second here. I think this morning I woke up after an all-night flight from San Francisco. That's a lousy flight. 4.5 hours, you can't get enough sleep, and you fall asleep to the point where you're tired when you wake up. I always come up with these phrases, and I just want to share them with you, and I always share them with my wife sometimes. I think I've kind of sanitized the wording in some of them for the use of this class, but it comes up. Passion's needed to start a great company. If you're not passionate about something, if you're just trying to find a way not to go work for a big company, that's probably not the right thing, and you probably shouldn't be an entrepreneur because, my brother, my younger brother, he's passionate, but he hasn't followed the 5 dimensions. So he seems to keep missing the target, but he's got passion. So you have to have passion to start. Passion doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be successful, but it is a foundational requirement. This is one, it's a concept I'll just note here: scalable, predictable, repeatable. It's what I've said from the early stage of every one of the companies. Can the business scale, right? You have a plan, can you scale it? Can you get it to the point where it's predictable, that we know if we do this, this is going to happen? and then can we repeat that? And replication of that is so important. And some of my sales guys call it the wash, rinse, repeat thing. Okay, that's their words. I just say scalable, repeatable, scalable, predictable, and repeatable. Every dog has his day, or every dog can get a bone, but strive to bite off as much as you can chew. You can get a small win here and there, but I think what really is great is when that passion drives you to the point where you really try to take on something big. And some people will say, well, look, I want to take on something big. I think by taking on something big and trying to bite off something big, you learn. And guess what? You may also fail. And I think I shared with you in 2000, I came to Silicon Valley. I pretty much lost everything. I was unemployed for the first time in my life for 8 months. And my dream was to go to Silicon Valley and be able to make enough that I could pay for my kids' college. But my point is, you've really got to go big or go home, and don't be afraid of the failure, because you learn along the way, and if you apply that learning, you're going to be in good shape. What did I put next on my list of things? What goes around comes around. Business karma is real. I tell you, I've been in so many backstabbing situations. I've dealt with people who you could not imagine they could be so corrupt and just bad. And it also always comes around. So, this is the integrity statement. Have respect for everybody you work with, respect for just individuals in general, and high integrity in what you do. It'll set the tone in your company, and it'll also make people you work with respect you. So you can't keep a good person down. Back in the day, so you can't keep a good man down. You can't keep a good person down. We're all equal. I mean, I'll be honest with you. In my career, I've had the privilege of working for some of the best women executives. My biggest leg up in my career was provided by 2 female executives. So I think there's total equality in the workplace now. And this whole conversation is gender agnostic. I've seen phenomenal CEOs, founders, both men and women. And I really do believe that good people who keep on trying will find their success, whatever that might be at some level. And then it's okay to fear failure. I did almost every day, and I still do. When I came to this talk today, I wondered whether what I was going to say was going to be meaningful enough to you, or it might just resonate with some of you, and you might carry that knowledge, And that's a good thing. It's the old, Bill Gates would always say it, paranoia, keeps you working and motivated towards things. And then the last one, if you get it right, you just must exceed your wildest dream. I went to California 15 years ago hoping I could come away with $5 million by doing a startup and pay for my kids' college, so I didn't have to take out student loans. I spent more time in Skibo. I was the student manager for Marriott at the time. I spent more time working in Skibo than I think I actually did in my classrooms, because it was so hard to do. So I really wanted to make that happen. And when I lost everything in 2000, I never imagined that 15 years later, I'd have over $200 million from doing startups. And it's just a great thing. So, if you get it right, you just might surpass what your wildest dreams were. In fact, in most cases, in my case, it wasn't even a dream. It wasn't even a notion of reality. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope with what I leave behind, you'll see that you can recover from a slow start.
With the right woman.
With the right woman, or with the right help, or with the right attitude, right? I mean, I've never been, I underestimated when it came to Carnegie Mellon the quality of students and competition on the grade curves. But I was a competitive person, and I was a person who was creative and wanted to win. It was H&SS back at that time was the college, and And really, I'll just say this as a final thought. It's been a long time since I've been back here. Again, it's an honor to be asked to come back here and participate today. It's in some ways a full circle. At some level, it's even emotional. But I really do have to thank, the quality of education I had here. It forced me to be better, and ultimately, it helped me. And truthfully, even though I think my final grade point average was about 3.2 or something like that, which isn't anything to write home about, right? But the quality of Carnegie Mellon as a college, as a university, that spoke thousands of words on my resume and opened the door. And ultimately, the whole education experience was a wonderful thing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to me. Questions?
All right, we have at least 5-10 minutes for questions.
Anything goes.
Question away.
I'm extremely approachable, even to.
I have a question. So, the one that I always question is, with serial entrepreneurs, certain people manage to come up with multiple companies that are successful in different industries, different sectors, different fields, and do they just come together, sit down and say, what field do we want to go into next? What kind of company do we start? Or, and essentially my question is, how do I stimulate that sort of creativity to start some sort of company, even in the first place?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you may not get that out of the gate, but what you will find is that as you get into that mode of creating a company, you do get exposed to other people. And initially, it might be the people you bring into the company, your closest friends or people can work with you, right? There's a lot of people you can also be exposed and introduced to. I know in Silicon Valley, I'm not as familiar here on the East Coast as much, but in Silicon Valley, there are a lot of groups of young entrepreneurs that get together, meet over coffee and stuff like that. But what you also find is that eventually you coalesce and your investors help you. So in a lot of cases, like I got a call the other day from some guys in Baltimore that had some great ideas, and it was a venture firm that told them to call me and share this idea with me, obviously under non-disclosure confidentiality. And they wanted to share the idea with me. And I then said, well, actually, I know some other guys you might want to talk to because they're thinking like that. So there really is a value in networking. The networking comes easy after you've done one or two. So, for example, I know serial entrepreneurs, their goal is not to build a company for a public market. They just want to build a company and sell it. And the backers who invest in them bring people to their attention, and then they start to see them as a catalyst for creating new companies. And at some point, you find yourself kind of at the center of opportunities coming your way. So it gets easier. At first, it's more of a networking thing. Certainly reaching out to people who are connected, but eventually the group of people you're involved with and the broader people you interact with. Eventually, too, as in the case of Nir Zook, boy, when we got together on Palo Alto Networks, we didn't have to look for talent. Everybody knew him and knew that he understood, and people come to you. So it's somewhat of a, there's no single answer. It just happens in a dynamic way, but it really does begin with a passion. The most passionate founders, they attract people. They've got a charisma in some sense. So develop that passion and charisma. Put everybody to sleep.
I don't know how technical you are, but do you think that has an effect on how you set the strategy in terms of like sales, how you position the product, and the product strategy?
That's a very good question from a standpoint that I wasn't a computer science major, I was a humanities person. Now, I was always kind of a tinkerer. You don't have to be the most technical person. You have to have a good executive function. Be able to, get the right people, get the right information. Palo Alto Networks, Lee Klarich is the head of product management, brilliant, best product management person I ever worked with. We'd meet weekly because I'm hearing things from customers, and I'd want to go to him as the product management head and say, have we been thinking about this feature? And I understood and I understand the way the technology works. I'm not going to know how to code it. I'm not going to know how to source components for the hardware, but I know the right questions to ask. So the answer is you don't have to be technical to be successful as a CEO, successful as a founder. You can get those people and bring them all together. You just have to be able to think strategically, be organized, and motivate people.
Like you just mentioned, and in your presentation you mentioned as well, like people are really important to starting a company, like who you surround yourself with. But like it seems to me that finding someone who shares like a particular passion you might have, or who could be, who you would work well together with, it's like very rare. So, do you have any advice on
Yeah,
how to do that?
it's harder if you're coming straight out of university and doing a startup. It tends to then be your classmates or some guys who you knew from a fraternity or from a club. It's a lot easier when you've worked in a company. I'm not advocating that any of you go work for a big company then. I worked 14 years with large corporations, which, by the way, is why I nailed it when I became a CEO, because I understood what a company should look like at scale. But I was able to dummy it down and say, okay, this is what we need to do from the early stage. But what I find with a lot of founders is that if they've worked in a company for 3 to 5 years out of college and they come on a great idea, they usually know a few guys in the company that they've been working with or interacting with who they can pull into a coffee room and have a little private discussion, say, all right, let's do it. Certainly coming fresh out of college is going to come from close friends and acquaintances. Or if you got a great idea, somebody like myself or others can say, ooh, let me put you with this guy here, and you might find it as well. There's ways to network. Yes?
Hi, David Jarn. I'm a second year MBA and 07 SCS grad. So you mentioned the time when you were having the issues with your sales team going out and actually making the sales.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about recognizing when something needs a heavier hand while riding the fine line of micromanagement.
Yes. That's a whole MBA course. And that's really interesting because I can border sometimes in terms, particularly in sales, because I spent so much time in sales. My first job out of Carnegie Mellon University was selling electronic cash registers to bars and restaurants in New York City for NCR Corporation. And man, that was hard. But they had a tremendous sales training program that really helped you understand sales. So when I'm with salespeople, sometimes I don't suffer fools too lightly. They got to know their stuff. But it really is about setting goals and expectations, and also being honest about things. I've seen founders and executives really get upset because sales isn't performing, but there's always a reason. If you go through the hiring process correctly, and I have a thing called the panel process, and it's a whole nother thing, but I created a panel process that we use to hire salespeople, where at the end of the day, if they made it through that panel and scored at a certain level, you knew that they were the right people. So if they weren't doing well and performing in the company, you can take the blame out of the guy isn't competent or you made the wrong hire decision. No, he met the criteria you set. Then you got to look to what those enablers are. And that's where I find the biggest issue is. So I think the responsibility really does first fall upon the management or executive team to define the kind of person you need to hire, to know that you've got the right pieces in place to enable and make them successful. And if that's in place and the salespeople can't rise to the occasion, then you have to look a bit deeper in terms of whether there's something you missed in the interview process or something like that. But I see so many situations where companies are churning through their sales organization, And by the way, when you fire a bunch of sales guys because they aren't making their numbers, that word gets out. Anybody know of a thing called Glassdoor? That stuff gets out there, and then the company culture gets criticized, right? You see things on Glassdoor, and people say, "Wow, that's not a place I want to work." They're cranking through salespeople like crazy. So I actually err on the side of the responsibility being the leadership, to do everything they can. I remember at Palo Alto, there's a great story here. The very first sales guy we hired, he was in Texas, and this guy, by all means, was a superstar. And we felt that in the first 3 months, the first quarter of him being a sales guy, he should be able to generate $50,000 in sale. Every one of these boxes costed $25,000, so he should be able to sell 2 of them. It's like, even if he had to go to a Girl Scout cookie stand, he could sell 2 of those, right? He sold nothing in the first quarter. So we said, okay, why? Well, because he wasn't selling it right. We fixed that. Second quarter, we said he should be selling about $175,000 to $200,000 worth of equipment. He sold nothing. Then the board starts saying, "You guys got it all wrong. You got the wrong hiring profile." I said, "No, we don't have it wrong. We're doing something else wrong." And the answer was, we put sales guys into territories where they didn't have any distribution partners, resellers. So the sales guy had to spend his first 6 months building his sales pipeline, his prospects. So we made a decision, well, let's not hire salespeople unless we know we have a distributor that he can work with in the region. So third quarter, he had $300,000, and from there we didn't look back. And so we had to examine our own enablement capability and our own hiring process before you can hang it on the salesperson. That said, salespeople at that point should be productive, and at that point it becomes a management issue, right? You got to manage them out, move them on. It's never a fun thing to do, but you have to do it.
Time for one
Okay.
more question, maybe. It's got to
Yes.
be a quick question.
Oh, I'll make it quick. Yes. The answer is
On culture in Silicon Valley has been blamed for a certain lack of diversity, that people wind up, people like us wind up going out and hiring people who look and act and think like us, and this lack of diversity is not necessarily good for companies. How might you respond to that?
I think there is some truth to that, but I think properly guided. I mean, I've always, a lot of people don't put a lot of emphasis on hiring a good human resources person. Oftentimes you sit in an executive team and the human resources person seems like the fifth wheel, it's just a people issue. No, it's a people issue. So I really think that the diversity aspect is part of the culture creation, and you do have to monitor that. And you do have to do things that intermingle. The hardest thing is when you're in a technology company, you got people who are nuts and bolts, programming, coding, heads down all the time, while you got sales guys on the other side and marketing guys, hey, high five, and those are very different cultures. And so in creating a company culture, you're going to naturally have diversity, and the real skill is to bring it all together. And it's funny, I'll just share one little thing. At Palo Alto Networks, I said we made fun of ourselves. We actually would have, every week we had the employees come together and create a rock video. And what we did was, they'd dress up like Led Zeppelin or something like that, and they were air guitaring, but they changed the words to make fun of our competitors. And it's like, we be down on our competitors, like in changing, Stairway to Heaven, the song, words like this. And we would watch them. We would have weekly employee meetings. This is when we were 40 employees. The company now has 1,800 employees. We'd watch the videos and who's going to do the next one? And somehow they got out, and somebody put them on YouTube, and I'm telling you, and before you knew it, prospects and customers were watching these internal videos just making fun of the competition, and we were getting requests to make another video, and it actually became one of the most effective marketing tools that we had. People thought we were such a cool company. We're not only got this great technology, they're willing to make fun of themselves and have fun. And we always made sure that engineering and sales, everybody was kind of part of that. So, there's a lot of special things you can do to make some magic, and sometimes they're most absurd and maybe not the most obvious. Anyway.
With that, thank you so much.
All right, my pleasure. Thanks.